your emergency vehicles immediately. We have a fire.
Speed, comfort. Two of the things we have enjoyed using air transport since 1903, courtesy of the Wright brothers. Irrefutably, aircraft add ease to our everyday transport lives in just pitch, yaw, and roll. But sometimes the big bird loses its balance and comes crashing most devastatingly. While every crash is bad, some are worse. And in this video, we will talk about 15 of the worst plane crashes in history. Number 15. Japan Airlines Flight 123. This crash is one of the worst plane crashes in history. It happened on August 12, 1985, when Japan Airlines Flight 123 took off from Haneda Airport, Tokyo, bound for Osaka. Everything went normal from the first minute until chaos erupted in the fourth and sixth minutes. The rear pressure bulkhead, which helps maintain pressure in the aircraft and protects the plane from bursting, suddenly ruptured. This fault caused a rapid depressurization in the cabin, ripped off the tail fin of the aircraft, and disabled the hydraulic systems. These are simply the things that allow the pilots to control the other mechanisms in the plane. In other words, without these essential functions, the pilots were left with a plane that was nearly impossible to fly. Before they could even think of getting out of the trouble, the aircraft began spinning out of control for a terrifying 32 minutes. After a desperate struggle, the pilots unfortunately lost the battle, and the plane smashed into the side of Mount Ogura. 505 passengers, plus 15 members of the crew, were killed, while only 4 survived. After this case was investigated, it was determined that the cause of the rupture in the bulkhead had been improper repair after an incident more than 7 years before the accident. This caused tightening in regulations and policies regarding aircraft repair by authorities to ensure that no easily preventable disaster of this magnitude could ever occur again. Number 13. Tenerife Airport Disaster. While mid-air accidents come to mind when we talk about plane crashes, this one happened on the runway. The crash involved 2 heavily loaded passengers 747s colliding on the runway. These planes were operated by KLM and Pan American World Airways. Both aircraft had diverted to the airport that day and were preparing to depart to continue their journeys to Gran Canaria. That day, the KLM aircraft was operating from Amsterdam Schiphol to Gran Canaria. On board were 2 34 passengers and 14 crew on departure from Tenerife. The Pan Am aircraft was operating from Los Angeles to New York JFK and on to Gran Canaria, carrying 380 passengers and 16 crew members. Unfortunately, on March 27, 1977, a series of uncontrollable events led to the 2 aircraft being on the same runway and unable to see each other. The first was that neither aircraft was initially intended to be at that airport. Along with several other aircraft, they diverted from nearby Gran Canaria Las Palmas Airport due to a terrorist alert. Had exploded in the terminal, injuring 8 people. The Canary Islands independence movements claimed the attack, and there was a warning about a second at the site. For that, all incoming aircraft were diverted to the much smaller Los Rodeos Airport. The airport only had 1 runway, 1 parallel taxiway, and limited aircraft parking. The diverted aircraft were forced to park on the main taxiway, meaning departing aircraft had to taxi into position using the runway. There were only 2 air traffic controllers on duty that day, and they had to handle much more traffic than the airport had ever seen before. The Pan Am flight was ready to depart first as its passengers had not left the aircraft, while the KLM passengers disembarked. However, Pan Am was blocked from entering the runway by the KLM 747 and had to wait for it to be ready. In fact, the flight engineer and first officer left the aircraft to measure the clearance, but determined they could not pass, so they had to wait. This was further delayed by the KLM flight fully refueling before departure, a decision that proved fatal in the end. The first officer and flight engineer had suggested refueling in Las Palmas, but the captain insisted otherwise. At 4:56 p.m., the tower gave the KLM aircraft clearance to taxi the length of the runway and line up for takeoff at the other end. At 5:02 p.m., it gave the Pan Am aircraft instructions to start its taxi along the runway and to vacate at the 3rd exit. So far, nothing unusual for a busy airport area that was having to use the runway for taxi and flight departures. The Pan Am aircraft did not, however, take the 3rd exit. This would have required two 148-degree turns to reach the main taxiway. It is not clear why this was instructed, but with reduced visibility and unclear instructions, Pan Am continued to taxi along the runway towards the fourth exit. The real problems began when the tower gave the KLM departure instructions, but not takeoff clearance. The captain released the brakes and applied power when the response from the tower where the runway could not be seen due to the cloud was, "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." The KLM crew likely missed part of this communication due to radio interference. At the same time, the Pan Am crew radioed, "We're still taxiing down the runway." The overlap led to the KLM crew hearing neither critical message. And again, due to the fog, the two aircraft could not see each other. It was not all that bad, as there was one more chance for a takeoff to be aborted. The next communication from the tower asked the Pan Am aircraft to report when it was clear of the runway. This was heard in the KLM cockpit, and the flight engineer twice asked the pilots if the other aircraft was clear, but it was not acted on. The KLM aircraft accelerated down the runway towards the Pan Am aircraft, which was approaching the fourth taxiway. Based on the cockpit recording, it was the Pan Am captain who first saw the aircraft approaching. He applied full throttle and attempted to turn the aircraft left towards the grass. When the KLM crew saw the other aircraft, they attempted to rotate early, as it was already too late to stop the aircraft. The nose and landing gear cleared the aircraft on the ground, but the lower fuselage and main landing gear struck the central upper fuselage of the Pan Am aircraft. The right engine detached and hit the upper deck. Fuel leaks caused a fire which claimed most lives. With the low airspeed and loss or damage to its engines, the KLM aircraft stalled and hit the runway around 150 meters beyond the Pan Am aircraft. With its full load of fuel, the resulting fire was devastating. The crash had 583 victims, with all passengers and crew on the KLM aircraft being killed. There were 61 survivors on the Pan Am aircraft, including the flight crew. However, both aircraft were destroyed. If this crash could have been avoided, this next one left no choice. Number 12. Deadliest mid-air collision. On November 12, 1996, two planes suffered a mid-air collision and came hurtling down in a small town called Charkhi Dadri, 100 kilometers west of Delhi. Of the two aircraft, one belonged to Kazakhstan Airlines and the other to Saudi Arabian Airlines. The crash took place at 6:40 p.m. when the Kazakhstan Airlines flight was approaching from the opposite side. The controller told the Kazakh plane to maintain 14,000 feet and wait for instructions. A short time later, the Kazakh plane reported being at 15,000 feet, 46 miles from the airport. The controller responded by saying, "Roger, maintain 150. Identified traffic at 12 o'clock. Reciprocal Saudi Boeing 747 14 miles. Report in sight." The Kazakhstan crew replied by querying the distance, to which the controller answered, 14 miles now, Roger 1907. When no reply followed, he again warned, traffic in 13 miles, level 140. For no reason at all, the Kazakh plane had descended below where it was supposed to be and collided with the Saudi Arabia Airlines Boeing 747. Immediately, both aircraft plummeted to the ground in flames. This crash killed all 349 passengers and cabin crew. Over 500 tons of material came pouring from the sky and landed in fields of mustard and cotton in Charkhi Dadri, Haryana. This crash at Charkhi Dadri helped make two major changes in the aviation industry. The reason for the crash was cited to be a miscommunication due to language differences. Because of this, global aviation authorities decided to make English proficiency a requirement for the industry. This ensured that pilots and aviation control officials alike would be able to understand each other easily and fluently to minimize any human error. The crash also resulted in the implementation of Travel Collision Avoidance Systems, TCS, in all aircraft. This device alerts pilots if an aircraft is intruding into their airspace. Number 11. Turkish Airlines Flight 981. Sometimes, just making sure that things are where they should be can save lives. Somehow, a minor issue caused a serious plane crash on March 3, 1974. Turkish Airline 981 was scheduled to fly from Istanbul to London Heathrow, with a stop at Paris Orly Airport. The first leg from Istanbul to Orly went smoothly, with a flying time of 4 hours. The Orly to London leg started at 12:32 p.m. local time, but things went wrong within minutes of the flight. Suddenly, while the aircraft was flying over Mo, around 50 kilometers, it lost its rear cargo door. The loss of the rear left cargo door caused a huge pressurization difference with the cabin right above it. This section was ripped off the aircraft, along with the 6 passengers seated there. However, the loss of the door resulted in pilots losing access to critical parts of the plane, including the rudder, elevator, and engine 2. The loss of control pushed the nose down 20 degrees and caused an increase in speed. Attempts to pull the nose up and level off failed, causing the plane to crash into the Ermenonville forest just 77 seconds after the cargo door was ripped off. The aircraft crashed at a speed of 783 kilometers per hour, splitting the plane into thousands of pieces. This made identifying the victims and collecting evidence challenging, given the sprawl of the wreckage. In total, all 346 on board died, which was made up of 11 crew and 335 passengers. After the investigation, it became clear that the cause was a design flaw and failure by ground engineers to ensure the door was in the locked position before takeoff. In particular, the plane's rear cargo door's hinge had not moved into the correct position, and the locking pins were not in place. This meant upon crossing 11,000 feet, the bolts gave way and the door swung open. That day, Turkish Airlines had no engineer on the ground at Orly, leaving baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi to close the door. After he followed the basic procedure, the warning light in the cabin was switched off, and he presumed the door had closed successfully. In reality, the locking pins were not engaged, and the cockpit light was a false indicator. Number 10. Air France Flight 447. On May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was scheduled from Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport, RJ, GIG, Brazil, to Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport, CDG, France as usual. What nobody knew was it would be its last. 216 passengers and 12 crew members on board AF 447 departed Rio de Janeiro. Nothing particularly notable happened along the initial climb to 35,000 feet, traveling along the coast of Brazil. As the flight moved north, they contacted Recife Control, which oversees the easternmost section of the country, along with some waters in the vicinity. Once far enough away from land, however, AF 447 would be in Fier Atlantico, which did not have conventional radio coverage and could not be as easily tracked. Weather in the area was rather typical for early summer in the area, which means powerful turbulence causing storm clouds. Just before 2 a.m. on June 1, 2009, the captain left the cockpit to take a rest, trading places with the third pilot. 8 minutes later, the 2 pilots felt warm and recognized a different smell, most likely the result of a large amount of water and ice being sucked into the engines. Ice crystals began hammering on the A330 as turbulence picked up. At 2:10, both the autopilot and autothrottle disconnected and the plane banked to the right. Critically, the airspeed indicator dropped from 275 knots to 60, and the altimeter dropped a couple hundred feet. Shocked and suddenly hand-flying, the first officer attempted to rectify the situation by inputting the left aileron and pulling up. Unfortunately, each sequential side stick input to return to level flight would, unfortunately, overcorrect the last, all the while climbing to 38,000 feet. A flurry of ECAM messages and warnings bombarded the pilots. Among them, a stall warning could be heard. Master warning and caution lights had illuminated in the chaos of lights, sounds, and confusion. Plenty of memory items on related checklists had been omitted. The pilots went back and forth, trying desperately to grasp the situation, as they were greatly confused. This turned the flight into a roller coaster of up and down pitches over the next couple of minutes. Sadly, Air France 447 found itself in a stall and fell out of the sky, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean. All 228 people on board lost their lives in this tragic accident. Number 9. Lockerby Bombing. On December 21, 1988, Pan American Flight 103, a Boeing 747, took off from London, bound for New York City. As it was climbing on its northerly flight path, it exploded over the town of Lockerby in the Dumfries and Galloway region of southwest Scotland. This explosion killed 270 people from 21 countries. At first, it seemed like something went wrong with the plane, but an investigation later showed that it was the result of a planted in a radio cassette recorder inside a suitcase in the forward cargo hold. The explosion punched a 50-centimeter hole in the left side of the fuselage. According to the investigation, no emergency procedures had been started in the cockpit, and no distress call was recorded. All that was heard was a 180-millisecond hissing noise as the explosion destroyed the aircraft's communications center. Because of accidents like these, the Transportation Security Administration now has different methods to detect explosives at airports. Number 8. Korean Airlines Flight 007. Forget about system malfunction. Flying was extremely dangerous during the Cold War. This was due to the political tensions of the era, coupled with air defense systems and heightened states of alert. The most dangerous parts are the areas in or near the border regions. Between 1950 and 1970, about 15 U.S. military planes were shot down by Soviet forces, while 3 Soviet planes were shot down by the Americans. But on September 1, 1983, a civilian airliner became the victim. Korean Air Flight 007, which was flying from New York to Seoul, suddenly disappeared over the Sea of Japan, with 269 people on board. The authorities began to search for this airplane, and soon it was discovered that Flight 007 was shot down by a Russian missile, probably while flying in international airspace. It had crashed off the southern tip of Sakhalin Island, a Russian possession to the north of Japan. This disaster prompted horror and outrage around the world, and it was strongly condemned by United States President Ronald Reagan, who described it as a crime against humanity. According to some experts, this incident brought America and Russia closer to war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Number 7. Air India Flight 182. For a long time, terrorists have targeted aircraft as detonation sites because of the number of people it would affect, and Air India Flight 182 is just another flight that was targeted. On June 23, 1985, the flight was traveling from Canada to India via London when it exploded off the Irish coast, killing all 329 people on board. The explosion was caused by a bomb in a suitcase that was transferred to the flight, even though the ticket holder had not boarded. On that plane were 268 Canadian citizens, mostly of Indian origin, and 24 Indians. While the flight was still in the air, another explosion at Tokyo's Narita Airport killed 2 Japanese baggage handlers. Investigators later said that this was linked to the attack on Flight 182 and intended for another Air India flight to Bangkok, but it exploded prematurely. Canadian investigators have alleged that the bombings were planned by Sikh separatists who wanted to take revenge for the Indian Army's deadly 1984 storming of the Golden Temple in Punjab state. Number 6. Delta Flight 191. After completing the first leg of the journey from New York to Denver, Delta Flight 191 took off from Stapleton Airport at 2:47 for a 2-hour, 26-minute flight to Portland. When the aircraft left the gate in Denver, it had around 46,700 lbs of fuel on board. And according to the flight plan, they only required 31,000 lbs of fuel from Denver to Portland. As the crew approached Portland, they lowered the landing gear and felt an unusual vibration. The indicator light that should have lit up to show that the landing gear had been successfully deployed did not light up, leaving the pilots to worry about the landing. In the worried state, they contacted Portland Air Traffic Control to ask permission to perform a holding pattern while they tried to diagnose the problem. For the next hour, the plane circled over southeast Portland as the pilots eventually decided they would need to perform an emergency landing. During the entire time they spent trying to solve the problem, they didn't check how much fuel the plane had left. During the holding pattern, the fuel burn had been exacerbated because the wheels were down, and the plane had its flaps at 15 degrees. As a result, as they were landing, the number 3 and number 4 engines flamed out. Lining out to land on Portland's runway 28L, they lost power to the remaining engines. After declaring a mayday, the plane crashed into a wooded area 6 miles southeast of the airport. Of the 189 passengers and crew, the flight engineer and one of the flight attendants and 8 passengers died in the crash. An emergency rescue was launched, and fortunately the survivors were quickly taken to local hospitals. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. Nothing can be more terrifying than being in a dangerous situation that would inevitably lead to death. While every means of transportation has its risks, air transport accidents are often catastrophic, not leaving chances for such things as minor airplane collisions or crash landings. And the craziest part is little or nothing can be done to save lives, as aircraft cannot be easily stopped in motion. With numerous advances in technology and aviation engineering, are we ever going to see the end of loss of lives from plane crashes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Number 5. Air Canada Flight 797. This is one of the most terrifying plane crashes in history. It happened on June 2, 1983. The Air Canada Flight 797 was coming from Dallas, Texas, and heading to Toronto, Canada. The cabin crew suddenly discovered smoke in a rest lavatory, and when they saw it, they decided to attempt to extinguish the hidden fire before contacting air traffic control and declaring an emergency. As smoke filled the plane, pilots made an emergency landing in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Greater Cincinnati International Airport. The fire disabled virtually all cockpit instruments, forcing the pilots to land the plane while flying blind. The airport's fire department immediately began firefighting operations after the plane landed, as passengers and flight attendants quickly exited the forward doors, while the captain and first officer exited through their cockpit sliding windows. Unfortunately, not everyone made it out alive, as a flash fire engulfed the plane's interior about 90 seconds after the exits were opened. In total, 23 people died in that fire. Number 4. U.S. Airways Flight 427. When U.S. Airways Flight 427 began its approach to land in Pittsburgh on September 8, 1994, the Boeing suddenly rolled to the left and plunged 5,000 feet to the ground, killing all 132 people on board. The plane's black box revealed the rudder had abruptly moved to the full left position, triggering the roll. But why did that even happen? The U.S. Air blamed the plane, while Boeing blamed the crew. It took nearly 5 years for the NTSB to conclude a jammed valve in the rudder control system had caused the rudder to reverse. As the pilots frantically pressed on the right rudder pedal, the rudder went left. As a result, Boeing spent $500 million to retrofit all 2,800 of the world's most popular jetliners. And in response to conflicts between the airline and the victims' families, Congress passed the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act, which transferred survivor services to the NTSB. Fair enough? Number 3. Ethiopian Airlines 302. While it took Lion Air Flight 610 13 minutes to crash into the Java Sea in October 2018 due to flight control problems, Ethiopian Flight 302 took only 6 minutes. The Lion Air flight plummeted into the sea as it suffered flight control problems linked in part to a flaw in the new aircraft's maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. The system mistakenly pushed the plane's nose down, despite the pilot's best efforts to correct it. Only 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, en route to Nairobi, Kenya from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff. Investigations revealed the plane suffered a similar fate as Flight 610. Between the two accidents, 346 people perished. In the wake of the two incidents, the FAA and Boeing grounded all 737 MAX 8 jets to fully investigate the aircraft, correct wiring issues, repair the flight control system, and allow pilots to receive more training on the aircraft. In November 2020, the MAX was deemed safe enough to fly, but its troubles are far from over. In April 2021, Boeing issued a statement ordering the grounding of around 160 MAX 8 jets to address yet another software issue. With the back and forth on these jets, would you board anyone you come across, though? Number 2. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. If you think airplanes are now free from being shot down, you should see this one. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 departed from Amsterdam Airport Schiphol Gate 13 minutes later than the scheduled departure time of around 12:30. At around 4:20, a ground-to-air missile, which had been launched from an area southeast of the aircraft, detonated outside the airplane, just above and to the left of the cockpit. The blast and fragments of the missile severely damaged the cockpit and instantly killed 3 crew members in it. A total of 283 passengers, including 80 children and 15 crew members, were on board. After investigation, an international team of criminal investigators said evidence showed the Buk missile had been brought in from Russian territory and was fired from a field controlled by Russian-backed separatists. This inhumane act led too many people to their early graves. Number 1. ValueJet, Flight 592. Although the FAA took anti-cabin fire measures after the 1983 Air Canada accident, it did nothing to protect passenger jet cargo compartments. It took the ValueJet 592 crash on May 11, 1996 to finally spur the agency to action. The fire in the plane was caused by chemical oxygen generators that had been illegally packaged by Sabertech, the airline's maintenance contractor. A bump set one off, and the resulting heat started a fire, which was fed by the oxygen being given off. The pilots were unable to land the burning plane in time, and that resulted in the death of 110 people. The FAA responded, by mandating smoke detectors and automatic fire extinguishers in the cargo holds of all commercial airliners. It also bolstered rules against carrying hazardous cargo on aircraft. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.